Our findings have been shared and coordinated with those of our allies, and they are clear. They are first that it was Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda, the terrorist network which he heads, that planned and carried out the atrocities on the 11th of September.
Video of bin Laden's gloating admission of guilt is a painful reminder to those leading the war that their demon is still at large.
I don't know whether we're going to get him tomorrow, or a month from now, or a year from now. I really don't know. But we're going to get him. I don't care, dead or alive, either way. It doesn't matter to me.
Whether he's guilty of this action or not, we don't know, but we know what his politics are, and we know what he does. And he said in an interview, I didn't carry it out, but it was a glorious deed, and the martyrs will go to heaven. Fine, well, that's his politics. But who is Osama bin Laden? Osama bin Laden worked for the CIA. Osama bin Laden was sent to Afghanistan when the Pakistani military intelligence appealed to the royal family in Saudi Arabia and said, we need to make this a real holy war. Will you kindly send us a Saudi prince to lead the jihad?
Afghanistan resisted 2 British invasions in the 19th century and defeated a 3rd in the 20th. The story of the latest war is unfinished. For years, Britain blocked attempts to modernise the country by bribing and stoking up the politically backward tribes of the region. In the 1970s, attempts were made to modernise the country. Women were given rights for the first time. Now it was America's turn to try to block political reform. They gave support to tribal warriors who were determined to resist change at all costs. The US deliberately provoked the Soviet Union to send troops in 1979. In the war that followed, American-backed religious fundamentalists fought Soviet forces. The country was devastated.
And so Osama bin Laden was officially dispatched by the Saudi regime and the United States to Pakistani military intelligence to fight the war. And they wiped out every single secular force in Afghanistan. Some of them fled, some were killed. The last leader of Afghanistan, who was secular, was hiding in the United Nations quarters, Najibullah. He was dragged out, bayoneted to death, killed brutally. His genitals were taken off and stuffed in his mouth, and then he was hanged in public. And the leaders of Western civilization, who are now fighting a war for their civilization, they tell us, stood by and didn't open their mouths.
The Taliban's days of harboring terrorists and dealing in heroin and brutalizing women are drawing to a close.
Our argument is not with the Afghan people. They are victims of the Taliban regime. They live in poverty, repressed viciously, women denied even the most basic human rights, and subject to a crude form of theocratic dictatorship that is as cruel as it is arbitrary.
Just think of the ironies of history. Who put the Taliban into power in the first place? Who armed them? Who financed them? Who created the religious boarding schools in which they were trained in hatred and fanaticism? The United States of America, backed by its ally Saudi Arabia, and of course given a base by its ever-loyal ally in Pakistan, the Pakistani military regime. And so I don't take them seriously when they say, we find these regimes offensive. They never found them offensive before the actions in New York.
Did they care at all about women's rights in the past couple of years? And what about supporting countries like Saudi Arabia, whose women's rights record is probably just as bad as the Taliban's were? So, you know, it just seems very hypocritical, and at the same time just as if they're using it as an excuse to go and justify what they're doing.
We warned that what the Mujahideen was doing being encouraged by American politicians like Zbigniew Brzezinski, who went to the Afghan border and said, "Go and fight the jihad. Allah is on your side."
We know of their deep belief in God, and we are confident that their struggle will succeed. You know, that land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again because your cause is right and God is on your side.
Well, where was Brzezinski when the WTC was bombed in New York? Where was he when the Pentagon was hit? When he was asked later, why did you encourage this? He said, we got rid of the Russians. What are a few jumped up Muslims? Well, he got his answer.
The evildoers struck, and when they did, they aroused a mighty land. We sent a loud message to the world. We will not be cowed by a few. We sent another message to the world. Together, we're going to bring these people to justice.
On the aircraft carrier Enterprise, F-14 and F-18 fighter bombers began their assault on Afghanistan. And nearby, cruise missiles were launched from the USS Philippine Sea, part of the Enterprise battle group. The missiles are believed to have taken about 2 hours to reach Afghanistan.
The afternoon skies over Kabul, a US plane clearly visible to all, not even trying to take evasive action from what little remains of the Taliban's air defences. These pictures from Al Jazeera TV show a crackle of anti-aircraft fire has no effect.
Some of us, older ones among us, feel that we've seen it all over again, the flashes of light in the middle of the night, the talk about precision strikes, targeted terrorist camps, humanitarian missions, international law. We've heard it all before, and just as before, we now discover what all this put together means.
The air attacks have been frightening. B-52 strikes and the dropping of a 15,000-pound bomb called a Daisy Cutter have ripped through cave hideouts, leaving a scarred, desolate landscape and bomb debris everywhere.
Within a few hours, they managed to knock over this United Nations building, and the United Nations representative stands there in Islamabad, holds a press conference, and through gritted teeth and clearly very angry about this, explains all that's happened and the names of it. So, and then after that, Tony Blair, when he's asked about it, says, well, we have to see what's happened. So what, is even the UN woman in on this conspiracy? What the hell is he talking about? He knocked the bloody place over then? Subsidence?
Mass bombardment 24 hours a day, with B-52 bombers opening their doors and dropping 1,000-pound bombs out. The very notion that that can be surgical or precision guided surely died many, many wars ago. And I don't think that that propaganda any longer plays the way it did.
And as for those innocent people killed by prettily named bombs, such as daisy cutters which are the nearest thing to a nuclear bomb, what will happen for those people's justice? Which court will redress their sufferings?
The military speak has been destructive because it doesn't increase understanding. I think it makes people not question what's really going on. I mean, daisy cutter, it sounds like a motor mower, something fairly banal. A daisy cutter is the worst weapon next to a nuclear bomb, and it's been deployed in Afghanistan. We've never seen it, not properly. There are some pictures of some after effects, but this is something that obliterates, completely 5 square kilometers and kills everything and every person in that place.
They learnt their lesson from Vietnam, and they've learnt, the effect of the body bags.
This will not be another Vietnam. Never again will our armed forces be sent out to do a job with one hand tied behind their back.
It is their new type of war, which is, aerial bombardment with the intention of having as little casualties as possible from the imperialist countries.
We still live in a world where a black person's life is not equal to a white person's life. Where a poor person's life is not equal to a rich person's life. And where an Afghan life is not equal to an American life.
The way the world is structured and the way the world is ruled, an American life is worth more than any other life, because it's the life of a citizen of the most powerful empire in the world today.
These carefully targeted actions are designed to disrupt the use of Afghanistan as a terrorist base of operations and to attack the military capability of the Taliban regime. We are joined in this operation by our staunch friend, Great Britain.
This military plan has been put together mindful of our determination to do all we humanly can to avoid civilian casualties.
There have been few attacks like this. One group of American planes bombed the enemy, the next took to the skies to drop food and aid.
As we strike military targets, we will also drop food, medicine, and supplies to the starving and suffering men and women and children of Afghanistan. The United States of America is a friend to the Afghan people.
How can you say we're not at war with the Afghan people while you're bombing them? How can you say that this is a humanitarian mission? How can you use those words if every single food parcel somehow, by some mysterious means, got into the possession of a starving person? Then all of them would feed 27% of the starving people of Afghanistan for one day. How can you possibly drop a bomb at the same time as you drop a food parcel and then call it a humanitarian mission?
Never forget how we felt watching the planes fly into those twin towers. Never forget those answering message machines. Never forget how we felt imagining how mothers told children that they were about to die.
We remember the cruelty of the murderers and the pain and anguish of the murdered. We remember the dead and what we owe them.
Yes, America has its faults, but it is a free country, a democracy. It is our ally. And some of the reaction to the 11th of September betrays a hatred of America that shames those that feel it.
There's been a lot of hypocrisy about this, it's like making it into an event like Princess Diana's death. It's slightly different, but building it up like that. And I think it backfired in many parts of the world, In large parts of the non-Muslim world, people were not celebrating, but they weren't too upset, let me put it like that. The whole of Latin America understood why they'd been hit. In China, people openly told the American journalists on the streets of Beijing, yeah, we are happy. And the journalist was shocked. He said, you're happy? They said, yeah. And he said, why? And they said, remember when you bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade? And the American journalist said, Yeah, but that was just 6 people who died in that. This is thousands. And the Chinese guy said, for us, even one Chinese life is very important. We don't see any difference.
We know about the way the Bush administration and Blair have exploited the horrific tragedy in America on September the 11th to further what are basically imperial aims in a part of the world that has been blighted and scarred by imperialism and kill people along the way. We know that. Who doesn't know it? We all know it. And I believe the British public know it.
We lose our bodies, we lose our souls, we lose our minds, we lose our sanity.
£10 for 2, anti-war t-shirts.
They're using this kind of, the fact that 73%, wherever they get that figure, of the British public support war. But most British people that I've spoken to are, at the very least, sceptical about it.
People generally are very angry because this war is not about fighting terrorism. There's much better ways of fighting terrorism, such as stop creating and supporting the terrorist groups in the first place, like the Taliban, and stop providing them weapons.
And bombing will never ever stop terrorism. Terrorism will stop to provide justice and peace to the world.
Get rid of world debt, and get rid of the arms trade, and tackle poverty.
Cowards! How brave is it? You drop bombs on shield civilians. Tell me how brave that is. Tell me.
Piss off.
Yeah? So that's what you're saying to that.
Children over in America that's still without a mother, a father, anybody. What about those children? What about the moms, the dads, the sisters, the brothers, the uncles? What about them?
Retaliation is not the way to solve a problem, and it's just really wrong. It's just as bad as what happened to America.
Some wars are just, against Hitler was just, but this is an unjust type of thing. We're powerful nations and keep on attacking defenseless countries. Defenseless Yugoslavia, defenseless Panama, defenseless Iraq, defenseless Afghanistan. They can just go on and they think they got mighty military machine, nothing could stand up to them.
I had hoped, naively perhaps you will say, that George W. Bush would distinguish between seeking justice and inflicting revenge. Unfortunately, President Bush's answer to our quest for justice was more governed by the Wild West, and his solution had more to do with lynch mob retribution than with the international rule of law.
I said a long time ago, one of our objectives is to smoke them out and get them running and bring them to justice. We're smoking them out, they're running, and now we're going to bring them to justice.
No case in international law can be made for the US attack on Afghanistan.
The right to self-defense is not a right to retaliate or seek reprisals. It is limited by rules that the force used must in no way target civilians and must be proportionate to the legitimate object of the mission. And we feel, therefore, that the current bombing and the current military approach is illegal under international law.
September the 11th was a crime, but not an act of war by Afghanistan. The majority of the people who took part in the suicide attacks were not even from Afghanistan, but from Saudi Arabia. But the US seemed less interested in law, more in revenge.
How will Kaaba bombing, Afghanistan, and the unspeakable bombing of innocent civilians, to whom we now refer as collateral damage, be the answer to terrorism? How can it be the bombing of a mosque like it happened yesterday, an answer to terrorism? How can it be the bombing of the United Nations and the Red Cross an answer to terrorism? Can you please tell me?
Let's get out there and tell people exactly why we're acting, what it is we believe in, and
dispel some of the myths and misconceptions and frankly lies that are put out by Taliban or extremist propaganda.
The dissident coverage of The Guardian, covering critical views of the war, is much larger than it was in the Kosovo War. The Independent has an advantage here because it's got a correspondent called Robert Fisk, who is structurally part of the newspaper, which means he writes. He's their chief foreign correspondent, and he writes and they publish, and often they publish on the front page. Then the other big difference in this war is that the Daily Mirror, which is a tabloid paper, has come out against the war, which makes a big difference. Big difference. For instance, they asked their former foreign correspondent, John Pilger, to write an article for them. He wrote a piece which they put on their front page under his headline, "This war is a fraud." As far as television is concerned, the agenda, by and large, has been set by the news managers in the Pentagon and the Ministry of Defense in Britain. I mean, by and large, television journalists have stopped being journalists and just report what is handed to them. They were all taken to the Northern Alliance. That's where they were based, and that gave you an early indication of how this war was going to be fought. Channel 4 News has occasionally put on critical voices, but by and large very few. Newsnight on BBC Two has been utterly appalling.
In the week of September the 11th, the BBC screened a special live edition of its Question Time programme. People in the studio audience were outspoken in their attacks on US policies.
It was a very good programme. It allowed a mix of views at a very important time, and it allowed free expression from Muslim people living in this country. It was a very good programme. It was a fine example of television at its best.
The audience was very angry and attacked the United States, and the former United States ambassador was in tears because he couldn't understand why people don't like the United States or its foreign policy. He couldn't understand that. And that's why Greg Dyke, this joker, crony of New Labour, who's given them money and was appointed Director General of the BBC, had to apologise publicly. Downing Street must have rung him and said, "Apologise, you've upset the former United States ambassador."
Disgraceful, absolutely disgraceful. One of the most disgraceful editorial decisions of recent years.
When there's a war, the BBC is the voice of the British establishment, no question about it. It will allow a few dissenting voices, but the overwhelming bulk of it, of course, is the view of the government of the day.
The first news report after September the 11th from the Palestine territories, the BBC journalist in Palestine, Ola Guerin, who's quite a serious journalist, said some people were celebrating, but the overwhelming majority was sitting inside their homes watching it on television like everywhere else. Subsequently, when the BBC repeated those images, they took off the voice which had contextualized those images. When you decontextualize it and take that voiceover off the image, then it becomes straightforward propaganda.
They never ever report any speeches at public meetings. You'll see somebody with a rubber mask looking like Bush. You'll see some Muslim shouting. You'll see somebody beating a drum and making a noise, but you'll never hear the speech. And it is almost a rule of the BBC never ever to report what's said at a public meeting. And the reason is that they don't want anyone else to have access to the public in the way I have to you. Just got to be their own voice interpreting everything.
Demonstrations are difficult, they make boring television. Let's be candid. I mean, once you see a lot of people on a march, then what?
Given that 5 or 6 large companies, giant companies, own the bulk of the means of information in this world, the television networks, the newspapers, it's a global phenomenon. It's the global market in the media. And the guys who own it are not going to allow passionate journalists from the other side to report.
violence gets coverage. If at Genoa no bricks had been thrown, there would have been no coverage. I remember I did a meeting with 2,000 pensioners, and there are 11 million pensioners in Britain, a significant body of people, a few months ago. And I said to the leader of the pensioners movement, this will not be reported unless you take a brick and throw it through McDonald's. If you throw a brick through McDonald's, and there will be a bishop on the red television tonight wringing his hands and talking about the rising tide of violence among old people, but there won't be any coverage otherwise, and he didn't throw the brick, and there was no coverage.
Every time the establishment of this country feels that it has to go off and drop bombs on someone somewhere, it seems that journalists have to undergo a lobotomy. This morning in The Guardian, a journalist of distinction, David Lee, wrote a whole lot of tripe that was simply propaganda about Iraq. He called the children who have died as a result of the blocking of humanitarian supplies in New York, he called them a statistical construct.
The siege, which is killing these little children, 1 every 6 minutes, who are dying before they even know that they are Iraqis, but they're dying for no other reason than that they are Iraqis. 6,000 Iraqi children every month for every year for 11 years.
There's an honourable tradition amongst liberal people and most journalists in this country to accept that the government tells lies about wars as long as it's a war that ended a few years ago. But if it's a war that's going on now, no, they're telling the truth. Everybody now accepts the Belgrano was sailing away when it was fired on. Everyone accepts the lies that were told about the Iraqis throwing babies out of incubators. Everyone now accepts, because NATO admit it themselves, that they even doubled the speed of the film of a train that was bombed going over a railway bridge in Serbia to make it look as if it was all a hurried thing and down to pilot error.
When they're bombing Kosovo, we had a couple of admittances that they'd bombed the wrong thing, okay? Like they bombed the train. And then actually, 3-4 months later, full reports were coming out in the national press saying, here's the number of schools they bombed, here's the number of factories they bombed, here's the number of hospitals they bombed.
During the Cold War, the BBC was jammed by the Soviet Union, and this was denounced as a proof of the failure of the Soviet Union to allow freedom. During the Kosovo War, the West bombed the television station in Belgrade, and when we asked about that, they said, oh, well, because television is an instrument of war. During the recent war in Afghanistan, Al Jazeera station, which has an audience of 70 million people, has had a huge impact. And there was an attempt to ban Al Jazeera from being broadcast in Britain because they showed some pictures of bin Laden.
The night before the Northern Alliance entered Kabul, the BBC correspondent there, William Reeve, was sending a report when this happened.
Jesus Christ. Down in the basement. Down in the basement. Get down there. Point.
An American missile had scored a direct hit on Al Jazeera's Kabul bureau next to the BBC office.
When the West wages war, the media becomes a central pillar of this war. That's why they're so nervous about Al Jazeera television. When Al Jazeera first came out onto the air, the New York Times was writing, this is wonderful. At last the Arab people have a free television network. True, I agree with that. Why not now? Why attack Al Jazeera? Why attack Arab networks who are trying to present both sides of the case?
The voice of Palestine station in Ramallah silenced by Israeli sappers.
I think the media is becoming more and more debased, and so we have to find alternative means of information. The internet has been a big advantage in that sense, but it's not enough.
We have freedom of speech, but we don't have the right to be heard. And unless you have the right to be heard, freedom of speech is a sort of almost a formality.
story of this massive British undertaking in Iran, with its great contribution to the prosperity of the Persian people, was beginning to be better understood by the rest of the world. At the turn of the century, Iran, or Persia, was a country of deserts and mountains, a few rivers and primitive rivercraft. Its undeveloped natural resources were suspected. There was oil seepage, and there were strange fires like the burning bush of the Old Testament.
The struggle for oil has been at the heart of much of the conflict of the 20th century. Time and again, the powerful industrial nations have tried to control the areas of the world where it's to be found.
All wars are presented by empires as being good against evil, dealing with the tribal warriors, dealing with troublemakers and so on. But actually they are an expansion of imperial power.
Serious trouble in Tehran, capital of oil-rich Iran. Its pro-Western ruler, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, has lost his throne, temporarily at least. When his army failed to oust the dictatorial-minded Premier Mossadegh, the Shah himself was forced to flee for his life to neighboring Baghdad. Another king without a country.
The Iranian leader Dr. Mossadegh was hailed by many as a force for modernization and democracy in his country. But he wanted to nationalize Iran's oil, a modernizing step too far for the Americans. The CIA overthrew him and paved the way for the return of the Shah.
In Rome, where he had fled, 33-year-old Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi hears astounding news. Royalist forces have revolted, arrested Dr. Mossadegh, and want their sovereign home.
The US had helped to topple the democratically elected government of Iran simply to protect its oil interests.
September 11th was the trigger for this war, but it wasn't the cause of this war. The cause of this war is that there's been an enormous process of globalization, of multinationals from countries like the United States investing globally in the last 10 years, and this has been linked to the process of the fall of the Stalinist powers in 1989 and the opening up of a huge tract of the globe running from the Balkans in the west to the borders of China in the east, and that this is now a contested area for the major powers, and the war both in the Balkans and now in Afghanistan is part of this process.
2 years ago, when President Bush was the governor of Texas, the state of Texas invited the Taliban to go to Texas to discuss a pipeline through Afghanistan from the Caspian to bring the Caspian oil to the west.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's congressional testimony given by leading executives of big oil companies 2 or 3 years ago, long before these present events, saying that the oil and gas resources of Central Asia are essential to America's economic future. Now, in America is importing 18% more oil now than it was 10 years ago, and so these are very important resources, and then saying we cannot get that oil and gas out of Central Asia, the former Soviet republics, into world markets without a pipeline, obviously. That can only either go through Iran, which is subject to comprehensive American sanctions, or Afghanistan. And one executive said we will not build that pipeline until there is a government in Afghanistan that has the confidence of lenders and our company. Confidence of the Afghan people, no doubt, being superfluous.
Getting rid of the Taliban does not deal with terrorism or with the causes of terrorism. Bush and Blair's war has created more refugees, given ground to a whole new generation of terrorists, made this country a target for terrorism. At home, it's led to racist attacks on Muslims, a tightening of restrictions on refugees, internment, secret trials, and the suspension of the Human Rights Act, all in the name of democracy.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
The biggest killer in the world is not terrorism. The biggest killer in the world is poverty. People in the West live 30 years longer or more than people in the underdeveloped world, and then they have the nerve to start talking about good and evil.
War is public expenditure not controlled by the IMF for. the World Bank. The arms trade is funded by governments, supported by governments to kill people, to make a profit for the arms manufacturers. And arms have been supplied to dictators all over the world to hold down their own people. And then when the country goes bankrupt, the IMF says cut short public expenditure on health and education to pay the debt that has been acquired by buying the weapons you didn't need to hold down the people the Americans saw as a threat to their interests.
This is serving the interests of the military-industrial complex, so they can keep producing, there will be demand for their products. In every war situation, there are a whole set of people out there who often you don't think about till after, who are actually benefiting, who are doing really well out of the war.
The US government is saying it's going to continue the war in the Yemen, it's going to continue the war in Somalia, they're going to continue the war wherever they think that there are terrorists linking together. And that's the most appalling prospect, because that means all these countries are extremely poor. The poorest countries on earth are Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, and these are precisely the places that are going to be attacked.
Somalia, 1993.
RPG! We took a hit!
6-1 is going down. 100 American soldiers found themselves surrounded by 5,000 rebel fighters.
We got a man down!
The only thing more incredible than the odds was how they triumphed.
Come on!
The US claimed its attack on Somalia was a humanitarian venture. But General Colin Powell called it a dress rehearsal for the future. It was an attempt to show the American Congress that the military needed big bucks to police the world. But things went wrong and American soldiers died. Now the US speaks of invading Somalia again as part of its war on terrorism. Many believe its real reason is revenge.
I think the British people have a right to be scared because a lot of people hate us. Our flag burns with the United States flag in the streets of third world countries all around the globe. And we're seen to be indissolubly linked to grave injustices being meted out by the United States and its allies in many parts of the world.
Afghanistan is still just the beginning. If anybody harbors a terrorist, they're a terrorist. If they fund a terrorist, they're a terrorist. If they house terrorists, they're terrorists. I mean, I can't make it any more clearly to other nations around the world.
The US is now investing in futuristic Star Wars weapons, weapons which it hopes will give it an unchallengeable power to attack any target on the globe.
If they could get the Star Wars through, then as I say, you won't even have to send bombers, you just send, it'll be done from space. And that will be the total military domination of the world by the United States.
The attack on Afghanistan sets an ominous precedent. The word terrorism can now be used to justify any attack on any country. It now justifies military invasion, the wholesale killing of civilians, and the toppling of governments. But who decides who's a terrorist? Who decides who America can or can't attack? Who will stop America doing anything it wants? The war against terrorism has not defeated terrorism. It has made the world a much more dangerous place.
The British government hasn't objected to the men being held in cages and at times shackled, manacled and blindfolded.
Shuffling in chains, this is one of the men America calls the worst of the worst. Now caged inside this makeshift prison called